When the waters receded and the final echo of divine judgment dissolved into silence, Noah stood at the threshold of a world washed clean, but not yet reborn. The ark groaned behind him, creaking like the memory of the world it had carried. Before him stretched a land stripped of life, cold and wordless. No angel descended to greet him. No voice thundered from heaven. No sign marked this moment as sacred, except for what he did next. He did not build a house. He did not rush to find food, gather his family, or stake his claim on the new earth. The very first thing Noah did was gather stones, select specific animals, build an altar, and light a fire, not for warmth, not for survival, but for sacrifice. A burnt offering, an act of worship. It seems like a simple moment, almost quiet in Scripture, yet its weight is immense. If Noah acted only by instinct, why did his actions follow such precise order? Why clean animals? Why a burnt offering? Why at that moment, in that way? Genesis gives us no answers. It records the act in a single breath. Noah built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings. But that silence raises the real question. Where did Noah learn to do this? How did he know which animals were clean, which were worthy of sacrifice? Why does he act, not as a survivor, but as a priest? This is not the reaction of a man relieved to be alive. This is the response of a man who remembers something ancient, something sacred, a pattern, a rhythm, a covenant not of words, but of practice. It is as if, stepping off the ark, Noah stepped directly into a role prepared long before the rain fell, one that had been dormant but not forgotten. This first act after the flood was not instinct. It was liturgy. It was memory. It was priesthood. And it demands a second look, not at what Noah did, but at what we were never told. Genesis mentions it only in passing, one line nearly buried in the aftermath of the flood. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings. No elaboration, no explanation, no law, no command, just a silent acknowledgement of an act too sacred, or perhaps too revealing, to linger on. But in that omission lies a question that ripples through time. Why? If this moment, this first act after divine judgment, is so significant, why is it cloaked in such brevity? Why is there no mention of how Noah knew what to do? Why doesn't Genesis explain the ritual, the criteria for choosing the animals, the meaning of the act? The silence isn't accidental, and it's not without consequence. But open the Book of Jubilees, and suddenly the silence is shattered. Here, Noah's actions aren't instinctual, they're instructed. The text reveals that after the flood, angels taught Noah the laws of offerings, the difference between clean and unclean animals, the sacred times, the holy seasons. It wasn't Noah improvising on a mountaintop. It was Noah fulfilling an ancient order, a calendar of divine rhythms already set in motion long before Moses, long before Sinai, handed down not through tribes, but through heaven itself. Jubilees 6 tells us that Noah didn't just build an altar. He wrote down the feasts, the weeks, the months, the appointed times. He kept the covenant of sacred time. He was not just a man of faith, but a man of memory, a memory not passed down orally, but delivered from above. This raises a deeper question. If Genesis is the beginning, why does it not begin with the fullness of this covenant? Why does it hint but not reveal the sacred system already in place? What if we've inherited a version of the story that's been stripped of its oldest codes? What if the priesthood didn't begin with Aaron or the law with Moses, but instead in the silence after the flood, when one man remembered a rhythm he never invented, but simply obeyed? Perhaps the real story isn't just what Genesis tells us, but what it leaves unsaid. If Noah offered sacrifices according to specific instructions, using clean animals in the right number on an altar constructed with purpose, then we must ask, how did he know? If there was a correct way to offer a burnt offering, there must have been a law. And if there was a law, then that law existed before Sinai, before Moses, before the tablets of stone descended from the mountain. This single implication is enough to rattle the pillars of traditional theology, because the foundation of most religious understanding tells us that the law began with Moses, the moment God wrote his commandments at Sinai, and a nation was born under divine order. But what if that was not the beginning? What if it was a return? Jubilees doesn't suggest Noah made a personal choice out of reverence. It says he was taught. Angels instructed him on the laws of offerings, clean and unclean distinctions, and the appointed times of worship. He wasn't acting on impulse. He was fulfilling a sacred role, one that predated Aaron, one that stood between judgment and redemption. So if Noah wasn't just a survivor, but a priest, where did that priesthood come from? And more importantly, who gave him the law? These questions don't just challenge timelines, they challenge the architecture of religious history. If Noah was the first to re-establish the covenant through sacred ritual, then he wasn't acting as a father of humanity. He was functioning as the first high priest of a restored world. That means Sinai wasn't the genesis of God's law. It was a continuation. This isn't a minor detail. It reshapes everything. It means the law wasn't born out of Israel's rebellion in the wilderness, but rooted in a tradition so ancient that even the flood could not wash it away. A law passed not through politics or tribal hierarchy, but whispered through angels, kept by men who still remembered Eden. And if that's true, then Moses didn't invent covenantal life. He recovered it. And the real question becomes, what else have we assumed began at Sinai that might have been far older and far more sacred than we ever imagined? There is a stillness in the moment Noah steps onto dry land, a silence not of absence, but of sacred anticipation. He does not fall to the ground in tears, nor shout triumphantly to the sky. He does not gather his family for a meal, nor build a shelter to shield them from the lingering chill. Instead, he gathers stones, selects specific animals, constructs an altar, and offers a sacrifice. This was not instinct. This was intention. The act seems simple at first glance, almost modest. A gesture of gratitude, perhaps. But when viewed through the lens of the Book of Jubilees, it becomes something far more profound. It is not merely a burnt offering, it is the reactivation of a covenant. It is the rededication of earth to heaven after judgment. It is a priestly act, performed in a world where no temple yet stood. Noah is not acting as a man saved. He is acting as a mediator, a priest. His hands do not shake, his steps are measured. Each action aligns with a tradition older than the flood itself. Jubilees tells us Noah was taught by angels, shown which animals were clean, how to prepare the offering, and when to perform the ritual. He knew the timing, he knew the pattern. This was not improvisation, this was remembrance. In this moment, Noah carries the weight of all humanity, all who perished, and all who would come after. He does not just thank God for survival, he stands in the gap between destruction and rebirth. He performs in solemn silence what Adam had once forgotten, what Abel once honored, and what would one day be codified through Moses. He brings it back. This is not the start of religion. It is the reawakening of something sacred, something ancient. And as the smoke rises from that altar, it marks more than a new beginning. It marks the restoration of relationship. A sacred rhythm is pulsing again on earth. A rhythm that was silenced by sin, but now, through one man's faithfulness, begins anew. Noah does not speak, but his actions say everything. The covenant is not dead. The offering is made. Let life begin again, this time in holiness. After the waters of the flood receded, what remained was not just land, it was the space to begin again. But beginning again without direction leads only to new confusion. That's why, in the Book of Jubilees, chapter 6, something extraordinary happens, a heavenly restoration of order. Jubilees tells us that an angel of the Lord taught Noah a sacred calendar, a system of time not rooted in agricultural necessity or human invention, but in divine rhythm. Weeks, months, appointed seasons, and jubilee cycles were all laid out with clarity and purpose. Noah didn't create the calendar, he received it. He was instructed to record it faithfully and teach it to his descendants so they would not go astray. The angel's words were urgent. These are the appointed times that must not be forgotten. Why? Because these times were not just markers of dates, they were covenant anchors. Miss the time and you risk breaking the rhythm. Break the rhythm and you step outside the alignment between heaven and earth. This calendar was not new, it was ancient. It stretched back to Eden. It was the same divine timing that governed the days when Adam walked in the garden. It was the rhythm Abel followed when he brought his offering at the appointed time. And now, after judgment had reset the world, Noah received it again, not to own, but to preserve. This wasn't about counting days, it was about keeping alignment. The Book of Jubilees makes it clear, sacred time is not a human construct, it's a divine gift. And Noah, though never called a priest by name, becomes one by function, because he doesn't just sacrifice, he keeps time. And by keeping time, he keeps covenant. We often overlook how much power there is in knowing when. But in the biblical worldview that Jubilees restores, timing is everything. It's not just about what you do, but when you do it. In the heavenly order, time is sacred space made visible, and that's what was given back to Noah, a way to make time holy again, a scroll not of prophecy, but of rhythm, a law not carved in stone, but encoded in the flow of weeks and seasons, a calendar that wasn't invented, but remembered. In Noah's obedience to keep this rhythm, we find the heartbeat of a world trying to return to Eden. And in that heartbeat, the covenant breathes again. Noah was not a founder, he was a keeper. That distinction matters more than we often realize. In a world freshly washed by judgment, when the soil was still damp with memory and silence clung to the mountains, Noah did not invent something new. He recovered something ancient. The Book of Jubilees doesn't portray Noah as a lawgiver, but as a law-bearer, a man who carried forward what others had already received and nearly forgotten. He didn't build a new religion. He built an altar. He didn't design a new system of worship. He remembered one. Taught by an angel, Noah didn't question, redefine, or edit. He obeyed. He offered sacrifice not in creative spontaneity, but in holy continuity. He selected the animals not based on survival instinct, but on sacred categories, clean and unclean, as already known from a deeper source. He followed timing not out of preference, but precision. This makes Noah not the beginning of something, but a bridge between Eden and Sinai, between the pure offering of Abel and the covenant at Horeb, between the forgotten rhythm and the reawakened law. We tend to think history flows forward, always progressing. But sacred tradition flows differently. It circles, cycles, and remembers. It's not innovation that preserves covenant, it's faithful repetition. In Noah, we see not the pioneer of religion, but the guardian of memory. He's the first human after the flood to stand on sacred ground and act as if Eden had not been entirely lost. And maybe that's the deeper role of a priest, not to invent the sacred, but to protect it, to hold what was entrusted, to keep what was revealed, to make sure the rhythm doesn't die in silence. Noah is the one who held the line. He is the silent link between divine origin and divine instruction, not a prophet with thunder, not a lawgiver with tablets, just a man with a memory and an altar. In that memory, Eden still breathes, and through his faithfulness, the covenant doesn't have to begin again, it only has to continue. What if the most sacred act after the flood wasn't surviving, but remembering the rhythm? The Watchers, according to the Book of Jubilees, did more than just fall. They dismantled the fabric of sacred time. They taught humans to count days differently, to feast at the wrong times, to forget the appointed seasons. That wasn't merely rebellion, it was sabotage. Because the covenant was not only about laws, it was about timing, a divine rhythm, a calendar of holiness where every seventh day, every appointed feast, every sabbatical year aligned Earth's pulse with heaven's design. When the Watchers disrupted that, they didn't just lead people into sin, they severed the timeline of trust between God and humanity. Jubilees names their crime clearly. They changed the weeks of the Jubilee, and in doing so, they will walk in the years of confusion. But Noah did the opposite. He didn't just keep breathing after the flood, he kept time. He honored the seventh day. He offered sacrifices on the right day, in the right way. He wasn't improvising, he was syncing his life back to Eden's rhythm. By doing so, he became not only a survivor, but a preserver. A man who stood on a cleansed earth and declared through action, "I remember." In Jubilees, this is what makes Noah sacred. Not his survival, but his alignment. His covenant was not just carved in stone, it was lived out in rhythm. He didn't need to speak. His actions became the testimony. Each offering, each moment of rest, each observance was a defiant act against chaos and a return to divine order. He was the keeper of time, and that made him the keeper of covenant. because in the logic of heaven, to forget the calendar is to forget the covenant. But to live in step with the divine timeline is to stay inside the shelter of GD's promise. Noah, in that sense, was more than righteous. He was a living clock of heaven. His faithfulness kept the world from drifting again. The ark may have saved his body, but the calendar he carried saved the soul of humanity. Genesis leaves us with a silence that feels almost intentional. After the flood, we are told that Noah builds an altar and offers burnt sacrifices. One verse. Then the narrative moves on. No explanation, no instruction, no indication of how Noah knew what to do, which animals to choose, or why any of it mattered. A sacred act, reduced to a footnote. But the Book of Jubilees breaks that silence. It tells us that Noah didn't act from instinct or guesswork. He was taught. The angels, under God's command, revealed to him the laws of sacrifice. They showed him which animals were clean and which were not. They outlined the laws of blood, what could be consumed, what must be avoided. They delivered a detailed priestly code centuries before the name Moses would ever be spoken. This isn't a contradiction, it's a restoration. Jubilees doesn't invent a new theology. It uncovers the roots of one that already existed. It shows that holiness didn't begin at Sinai. It had a pulse long before, a rhythm given to Adam, remembered by Enoch, practiced by Noah. The sacrificial system, the distinction between clean and unclean, the reverence for blood as life, these weren't post-flood innovations. They were ancient, sacred inheritances. And yet, Genesis is silent. Why? Was it assumed that the audience already knew these laws, or was something lost, edited, hidden? We may never know, but we do know this. Jubilees fills in the blanks. It doesn't contradict Scripture. It whispers what was once common knowledge, now forgotten. The implications are massive. If Noah acted according to divine instruction, then the priesthood began not with Aaron, but with him. If laws existed before Moses, then God's covenant has always had a structure, long before Mount Sinai. And if that structure was known, practiced, and sacred, why was it hidden? Genesis gave us the surface. Jubilees reveals the depth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. A covenant is not just ink on stone or parchment. It is not merely a legal agreement passed down through language. It is rhythm, a sacred cadence that pulses through time, woven into the very structure of creation. When we think of the covenant, we often imagine laws, commands, declarations. But what if it was more than that? What if it was a living pattern? Jubilees teaches us that the covenant breathes through action, not abstraction, through offerings given at the right time on the appointed day, through a Sabbath kept not out of obligation, but because time itself was hallowed, through a sacrifice made not in a grand temple, but on bare stone, with bare hands, under an open sky. Noah had no scrolls, no tablets, no tabernacle, yet he lived the covenant. How? By aligning his life with the divine rhythm, by remembering the correct day, by choosing the right animals, by offering them not when convenient, but when it was commanded. It was not the object that sanctified the act, it was the timing. It was the obedience to rhythm that made the altar holy. This is what Genesis doesn't say, but Jubilees does. That sacredness lives in repetition, in right order, in choosing to remember what others forget, in keeping the time heaven set before the world tried to rewrite it. A single act of remembrance can reignite the flame. You do not need a title to be a priest. You do not need a temple to be faithful. You only need to step in sync with that sacred beat, to keep a day that no one else keeps, to light a flame when no one else sees darkness. That is how the covenant survives, not through volume, but through rhythm. And when one person keeps the rhythm, the covenant does not die, it lives. When the waters receded and silence covered the earth, Noah did not rush to rebuild a shelter or secure food. He did not seek comfort or declare victory. The very first thing he did was build an altar, not out of desperation, but devotion, not out of fear, but faithfulness. This is the image we are rarely shown. Noah is often remembered as a survivor, the man who built the ark, saved the animals, and floated through the storm. But survival was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new calling. He stepped out of the ark not as a mere man saved by grace, but as a keeper of something sacred, the last guardian of a forgotten rhythm. No title was given to him. No priestly garments adorned him, and yet his hands offered the first sacrifice of the new world. He lit a fire not just to thank, but to reconnect heaven and earth, to stand in the gap, to re-establish the divine order through one quiet, deliberate act. This is what makes Noah more than a name in a flood story. He was the keeper of the flame. In a world washed clean, he brought back the first light, a man who bore no crown but carried the memory of Eden, and through his offering he reminded heaven, "I remember." And maybe that was all God needed to begin again. We've long believed that the covenant began at Sinai, that divine law first descended with Moses in fire and thunder. But what if the flame had already been lit long before that mountain trembled? According to the Book of Jubilees, Noah was not just a man of obedience, he was a man of remembrance. He knew about clean and unclean animals. He followed laws concerning blood. He observed sacred times. These weren't last-minute revelations. They were preserved traditions, carried through the flood, kept alive by a man who remembered a rhythm the world had forgotten. The Sabbath was not born at Sinai. It was kept by Noah. The laws of sacrifice did not originate with Leviticus. They were honored by Noah. The instructions concerning purity, blood, and offerings weren't sudden commandments. They were continuations of a covenant already living, passed from Adam to Abel, from Abel to Enoch, and now rekindled by Noah. This changes everything. It means the covenant wasn't new, it was restored. And Noah wasn't just the first of a new generation. He was the bridge that carried an ancient law across the floodwaters. Sinai may have been the echo, but Noah was the memory. He wore no breastplate, held no staff, bore no title. But Noah acted with more priestly authority than any descendant of Aaron ever had to earn. On the day he stepped onto a silent post-flood earth, he did not seek land, food, or shelter. He sought alignment with heaven. He selected clean animals, gathered unblemished offerings, and built an altar, not as a spontaneous gesture of gratitude, but in full compliance with a ritual law he had been taught. Not law from Moses, but from the angels, recorded in Jubilees. Noah didn't invent sacrifice, he remembered it. He performed it not out of instinct, but out of obedience, not to survive, but to restore. And in that moment, Noah became something the Bible rarely calls him, but the Book of Jubilees clearly reveals. A priest, not a Levitical priest, not a temple priest, but a covenantal priest, one who stands between heaven and earth and makes sacred what had been drowned in sin. Aaron would come centuries later, appointed with symbols, but Noah came first, appointed with faithfulness. If priesthood is about representing the people before God, then Noah stood as the first, and he did so not with words, but with fire, not with robes, but with memory, not with a title, but with timing. He's often just a name in a genealogy, Shem, son of Noah. We pass over him quickly, moving from the floodwaters to the patriarchs, forgetting that between survival and promise stood a man who kept time not by the sun, but by sacred rhythm. According to the Book of Jubilees and ancient traditions, Shem was not merely a son, he was a guardian, the one who received the sacred calendar from Noah, who understood the seasons, the festivals, the appointed times that God had designed not for nature, but for covenant. Shem kept the 364-day cycle. He knew which offerings belonged to which day, which festivals marked divine remembrance, which Sabbaths carried echoes of Eden. He was the quiet bridge between Noah and Abraham, the silent carrier of priestly knowledge when the world was rebuilding and language itself had fractured at Babel. He didn't build nations. He didn't wage war. He kept the rhythm. And because of that, Abraham inherited not just land, but memory. A memory Shem had guarded like fire in a windstorm, alive, though flickering, hidden, yet burning. To remember Shem rightly is to remember that some of the most sacred roles are not loud, they're rhythmic, hidden in time, kept alive by the few who dare to live in sync with heaven's clock. Long before Moses walked the desert, before tablets of stone were etched on Sinai, Abraham was already following a rhythm older than empire, older even than Israel. In the Book of Jubilees we find something astonishing. Abraham kept the feast of Passover, before Passover had a name. He offered sacrifice on the very night future generations would flee Egypt, centuries before the event itself. Not out of coincidence, but out of sacred alignment. He knew the day. He knew the act, because Shem had passed down the calendar, and Noah had received it from the angels. Abraham didn't invent this obedience. He inherited it. He practiced offerings at appointed times, not merely when he felt moved, but when the heavens declared it was time. He moved in sync with an invisible timeline, carved not by history, but by covenant. And that changes everything. It means that what we call tradition was, to him, memory. That what we consider Jewish law was once the common rhythm of the righteous. Those who lived before law was written, but not before it was lived. To follow Abraham's footsteps is not just to believe, it is to remember. To enter a rhythm that was beating long before Sinai and still echoes for those who can hear it. When Moses stood atop Sinai, he was not inventing something new. He was answering a call that had echoed since Eden. The laws he received were not novel decrees, they were restorations. Pieces of an ancient covenant, once lived by Abel, kept by Noah, passed through Shem, and walked by Abraham. Moses was not a founder. He was a gatherer of forgotten threads, woven into a pattern that had been broken. He didn't create the sacred rhythm. He realigned Israel with it. In that moment, the mountain did not mark a beginning, it marked a return to the covenant that had always been alive, waiting to be remembered. You don't need to memorize every law. You don't need to become a prophet. You don't need to rebuild an altar of stone. Sometimes all it takes is to keep time, divine time, to honor one sacred day, one appointed season, one rhythm that was written before calendars ever existed. The covenant wasn't built on grand temples or thunderous voices. It was built on small acts of alignment. When Noah stepped out of the ark, he didn't deliver a sermon. He waited for the right day, chose the right animals, and offered them in the right way. He kept the rhythm. That was enough. You don't have to do everything. You just have to do one thing right. Maybe it's resting on a day the world doesn't recognize. Maybe it's fasting during a forgotten time. Maybe it's stepping away from noise to remember what was once sacred. It doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be aligned. One step in rhythm with heaven is enough to link your life with Noah, with Shem, with Abraham. One day kept faithfully can hold the entire thread of covenant within it. And if enough people keep that rhythm again, then the covenant will live again, not in writing, not in theory, but in us. If something within you stirred while listening, if a still, quiet recognition awakened in your spirit, then maybe this message wasn't just for your curiosity. Maybe it was a calling. Not everyone hears the rhythm. Not everyone senses when something sacred has been forgotten. But if you do, if something about Noah's altar, Shem's silence, Abraham's obedience resonates deep in your soul, then perhaps you are not just an observer of this story. Perhaps you are part of it. You don't need a title. You don't need a pulpit. You don't need to explain yourself to the world. All you need is faithfulness to the rhythm. One act, one day, one thread of covenant kept alive in your own life. Because when the covenant is forgotten, it doesn't vanish. It waits. It waits for someone who still remembers, someone willing to guard it, live it, pass it on, not by preaching, but by pattern, by keeping sacred what the world deems unnecessary, by honoring what was given before Moses, before the temple, before the institution. If you still feel it, if the fire hasn't gone out in you, then you are the keeper, and the covenant still lives.